In 1936, Jean-Paul Sartre, who would go on to become one of the most influential intellectuals in post-war Europe, published an essay in which he declared that John Dos Passos was the greatest writer of our time. Not the greatest American writer. The greatest writer. In the world. In any language. Sartre's Roads to Freedom trilogy directly shows the influence of Dos Passos's methods. Alfred Doblin's Berlin Alexanderplatz shows it too. Norman Mailer said that the 3 volumes of USA make up the idea of a great American novel. The Italian neorealists, Pavese, Moravia, Vittorini, discovered him and were transformed. D.H. Lawrence called Manhattan Transfer the best modern book about New York. And then he died in 1970, in near total literary obscurity, having campaigned for Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon, having written what critics called flat, didactic novels in service of right-wing politics, having been declared, by wide critical consensus, a writer who had outlived himself. He rose from a childhood as the illegitimate son of a financial titan to become a literary titan. A progressive writer who turned his passions into the groundbreaking USA trilogy, Dos Passos later embraced conservative causes. At the height of his career he was considered a peer of Hemingway and Fitzgerald, yet he died in obscurity in 1970. And the question at the center of it is not just literary. It is the question of what happens to a great artist when the political identity that generated his art collapses, and what it costs a human being to outlive his own genius. John Rodrigo Dos Passos was born in Chicago on January 14, 1896. He graduated from Harvard College in 1916 and traveled widely as a young man, visiting Europe and Southwest Asia, where he learned about literature, art, and architecture. The biography begins with a complication that will shadow everything. Dos Passos was the illegitimate son of a financial titan. His father was a wealthy lawyer of Portuguese descent who could not publicly acknowledge him until much later in his life. This meant a childhood of displacements, of European hotels and boarding schools, of being permanently slightly outside the social world he moved in. It is not irrelevant. The outsider's eye, the observer who sees the social machinery clearly precisely because he is not entirely inside it, would become the defining quality of his fiction. He volunteered as an ambulance driver in World War I, and his early works were basically portraits of the artist recoiling from the shock of his encounter with a brutal world. Among these was the bitter anti-war novel 3 Soldiers, from 1921. 3 Soldiers was received as naturalism, as the work of a rude American soldier disillusioned by the trenches, turning to socialism out of class resentment. But Dos Passos was not a rude soldier. He was a Harvard-educated artist with the sensibility, at the surface of his skin. The war wounded him not as a working-class man losing faith in democracy, but as an artist losing faith in language. The official phrases, duty, sacrifice, glory, the defense of civilization, had been used to justify carnage on an industrial scale. They were lies. And for a man whose entire vocation was language, the discovery that official language was organized lying was not a political education. It was a catastrophic aesthetic event. He went to Europe looking for something to replace the ruined official phrases. And he found 2 things that changed everything. The first thing he found in Europe was Jules Rimet and the French literary movement called unanimism, the idea that the collective life of a city, a crowd's shared emotion in a given moment, could be the true subject of fiction. Not the individual hero tracing his arc through society, but society itself as the protagonist, the simultaneous, interlocking, contradictory lives of thousands of people, each carrying a fragment of the whole. The second thing he found was James Joyce's Ulysses. He read it and understood immediately that a new novel was possible, a novel that used the techniques of montage, of fragmentation, of documentary collage, to do for narrative what Joyce had done for language, to decompose the old structures and recompose them in a form that could carry the actual texture of modern experience. The result of these two encounters was Manhattan Transfer, published in 1925. Sinclair Lewis, a writer not particularly known for poetry, was moved to write about it: the smell of the city, the sound of dirty water around the barges, the yellow light in a skyscraper window at midnight revealing either a forbidden love or a tired accountant, the absurd noise of the subway and the tunnels, the smell of spring in the parks, the police patrol, the joyful cries of seagulls above, and the sighs of abandonment in the shelter of those who have no other refuge. Manhattan Transfer ranks with James Joyce's Ulysses as a powerful and often lyrical meditation on the modern city. Using experimental montage techniques borrowed from the cinema, vivid descriptions and bursts of overheard conversation, and the jumbled case histories of a picaresque cast of characters from dockside crapshooters to high society flappers, Dos Passos constructs an impressionistic portrait of New York City as a great futuristic machine filled with motion, drama and human tragedy. But Manhattan Transfer, for all its formal innovation, was still essentially the protest of an individualist, an artist's cry against the ugliness and cruelty of the modern world, without a fully articulated understanding of why the world was that way. The Great Depression would provide that understanding. And what it produced was the work by which Dos Passos will be remembered. The 1930s saw the publication of his USA trilogy, The 42nd Parallel, from 1930, 1919, from 1932, and The Big Money, from 1936. Dos Passos developed experimental literary devices where narratives intersect and continue from one novel to the next. The USA trilogy also included what became known as newsreels, impressionistic collections of slogans, popular song lyrics, newspaper headlines, and extracts from political speeches. The formal architecture of USA is worth describing carefully, because it is one of the most original structural inventions in the history of the novel. Each volume interweaves 4 distinct layers. The fictional narratives follow a range of characters, not heroes, not protagonists in the traditional sense, but representative American lives: a labor organizer, a stenographer, a public relations man, a society girl, a radical journalist, a soldier. Alongside these, the newsreels cut in fragments of actual newspaper headlines, popular songs, political speeches, the raw debris of the historical moment. The camera eye sections give us the author's own stream of consciousness, lyrical and oblique. And the biographies offer brilliant, savage portraits of real Americans, figures like Henry Ford, Thorstein Veblen, Isadora Duncan, Eugene Debs, sketched in prose of scalpel-like precision. Sartre wrote about the experimental techniques in his literary and philosophical essays. Dos Passos has invented only one thing: an art of storytelling. But that is enough to create a universe. Dos Passos was doing with this machine what Joyce had done with language, decomposing and recomposing it, but Dos Passos was doing it with his immense documentation. Like a photographer superimposing images on images, he layered the imaginary biographies of fictional characters over fragments of real biographies of typical Americans, newspaper reports over nostalgic evocations of his own youth. A mosaic in colossal format. A complete panorama of the American world, but a panorama that broadcast, like a loudspeaker, a single message: the devaluation of all values by economic crisis. Those characters who pursue the big money without scruple succeed, but they end dehumanized. The others are ground down by forces they cannot see and cannot name. The formal incoherence of the structure was not a failure. It was the point. The world was, and still is, a chaos. The incoherence in the novelistic structure mirrored the incoherence of that world's values. By the mid-1930s, Dos Passos was at the peak of his influence. USA was being read across the world. Sartre's essay had appeared. The Italian neorealists were beginning their encounter with his work that would transform their own fiction. He was, by the measure of serious literary culture, the most consequential American novelist alive. And then came Spain. Dos Passos helped organize American support for the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. He traveled to Spain in 1937, where he learned of the brutality of Stalinist communists who secretly used ruthless tactics against their anti-Franco allies. His friend José Robles, a Spanish intellectual who had been his translator, a man who supported the Republican cause, had been arrested and executed by the communist secret police. Robles's execution caused a total rift between Hemingway and Dos Passos, who were previously friends. Hemingway condoned the killing as necessary in time of war, while Dos Passos, embittered by the death of his friend, broke away from the left altogether and started his move to the political right. It is impossible to understand what happened to Dos Passos without understanding this moment. His drift rightward was not cynical. It was not opportunistic. It came from the same root as his leftism had come from, a deep, almost physical revulsion at the lie. The communists had murdered his friend and then lied about it. The lie was the same structure as the patriotic lies of 1914, official language used to cover official violence. He began as a left-leaning anarchist, one critic wrote, and ended as a right-leaning libertarian. His political principles, in his own reckoning, never changed. But totalitarian communism forced his re-evaluation of anarchism and its transmutation into libertarianism. This is true as far as it goes. But the aesthetic consequences were catastrophic. Because the great technical achievement of USA, the montage of voices, the superimposition of documents, the camera eye's lyrical subjectivity, had been powered by a specific political energy, the energy of negation, of exposure, of stripping bare the lies of official America. When that energy turned against the left instead of the right, the technique remained but the power drained out of it. After the 1930s, Dos Passos turned toward conservative politics, associating himself with the National Review and writing a right-wing counter-trilogy to USA. Dos Passos's literary reputation suffered as his right wing turn discredited him. Dos Passos had negated all official values. Then he negated all values. And having negated all values, his extraordinary technique for negation became a kind of l'art pour l'art of negation, a routine. The method remained. The necessity was gone. By the 1950s, his political views had changed dramatically. In the 1960s, he campaigned for the Republican Party's presidential candidates Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon. The man who had written about the murder of labor organizer Joe Hill in USA, who had turned the execution of Nicolas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti into one of the most powerful passages in American prose, was now lending his name and his pen to the conservative cause. The irony was total and, for anyone who loved his early work, genuinely painful. But there is something important that is easily lost in the story of the political turn. None of what happened afterward should make us forget the role of the USA trilogy in the history of modern literature. Dos Passos's style of emphasizing history and current events in his narrative and his striving to produce an all-encompassing portrait of the America of his time influenced many later writers of the 20th century, including Jean-Paul Sartre, Norman Mailer, and E.L. Doctorow. There is a further irony. When Sartre and the French rediscovered Dos Passos after World War II, when the Europeans who had lived through fascism, war, and resistance found in his work the tools to describe their own fractured experience. They were reading a man who had already begun his political reversal. They were using the formal instruments of USA, developed in the service of a radical anti-capitalist critique, to do something different, to describe the experience of any person trapped in history, regardless of which direction history was moving. That is the mark of a technique that transcends its original political intention. That is the mark of a genuinely original artistic invention. John Dos Passos died on September 28, 1970, in Baltimore. He was 74 years old. The Modern Library ranked USA 23rd on its list of the 100 best English-language novels of the 20th century. It is a ranking that most serious readers of the novel would consider, if anything, too modest. What do we do with a writer whose greatest achievement is permanent and whose subsequent career was the spectacle of a man who survived himself? The spectacle of Dos Passos is the most comparable example of a collective critical error in literary history. First he was misread as a naturalist, then celebrated as a radical, then abandoned when the radicalism soured, then forgotten. Each misreading was, in its own way, a refusal to see the actual achievement, the formal invention, the colossal mosaic, the art of telling a story that creates a universe. That art does not belong to the left or the right. It belongs to the history of what the novel can do. And the history of what the novel can do is larger, more patient, and more unforgiving than any political moment, including the ones that produce, and then destroy, the reputations of the men who make it. Sartre called him the greatest writer of his time. He was not wrong about the work. The work survived. The man who wrote it, in a sense, did not. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story.